Hello to all participants and attendees, and thank you very much for joining us today from different parts of the globe for our online activities in the framework of the project GLAM and Digital Soft Power in the Post-Pandemic Reality. For all those who join us the first time, let me take a few minutes to introduce the project to you and share also what is our agenda for today. The research project brings together academics, policymakers, and GLAM professionals to explore innovative ways to advance, activate, and communicate the value of heritage collections in the global media environment to develop meaningful digital cultural relations with audiences and communities. The project also aims to employ the power of data and machine learning to develop new methodologies and tools for GLAM institutions to better understand, evaluate, and even forecast their impacts, as well as to provide an inductive research platform for strategic development and growth. I'm very happy to invite you to our second Datathon, Understanding and Mapping Digital Museum Audiences. The event will offer a discussion space to play with and evaluate the second layer of the software prototype that aims to visualize museum online audiences to explore a museum potential and actual reach in different countries around the world. We designed it by aggregating data from two museums, Museum Science Group in London and our Asian Civilisations Museum in Singapore. The webinar will include three important activities, a demo presentation of the new prototype of the second layer, interactive evaluation panel, and finally the discussion forum. And each of these parts will take no longer, should not take no longer than 30-40 minutes. And we will open the session with an introduction of our co-host, Professor David Goodman, Director of the Digital Studio at the University of Melbourne. And we will close the session by discussing exciting digital audience research projects conducted by different museums in Australia and in the UK. Before we start, and even New Zealand, before we start, I wanted to thank you all for coming today and invite our audiences to use chat or Q&A function to submit your questions to our panelists and participants, to myself, and we will try to address all the questions throughout the event. It's my great pleasure to share the floor now with our co-host, Professor David Goodman from the Digital Studio at the University of Melbourne, the space where the first pilot application Museums of Power map was first born back in 2017. The Digital Studio provided a tremendous support for this project by offering workspace for 17 research assistants working on the project and also developing a direct collaboration with the Australian Center for the Moving Image, who played a really unique role in the design of the demo application. David is a historian who has published extensively on the history of broadcasting and propaganda, and he just recently joined the Digital Studio in the role of its new director and the leader, and he has really amazing plans for its further development, including implementations of very exciting international projects. Contributing to the development of the academic field of the digital humanities. So David, you are most welcome.
Thank you very much, Natalia, and I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. So I was asked just to very briefly introduce our digital studio at here at the University of Melbourne, and Natalia's already mentioned some of the things that ideally happen here, which is supporting researchers within the university doing ambitious digital projects. I should stress I feel totally fraudulent giving this presentation in a way, because I've been director only for a few months, most of those in pretty heavy lockdown here in Melbourne. So I'm going to talk about the past, which I can take no credit for, and talk briefly about the future. So what is the Digital Studio? I think we're very lucky to have quite a bit of real estate right in the centre of our campus here in Melbourne. It's a city centre campus. We've got 2 floors of a building, and a couple of pictures there give you some sense of the mix of spaces, of sort of big open plan partitionable workshop meeting space, screens just everywhere, which allow for exhibitions and so on, including a couple of these immersive rooms where there's an art installation there at the moment. This is what it says on our website. We're interested in high quality projects in the humanities, arts, social sciences to support researchers and partners working with data and digital environments. The centre has, for the last four or 5 years, run really interesting seminars, many of them before the pandemic, more in person, the last 2 or 3 years more online, and you should keep an eye out because we're going to continue to run online events. On the left here is some of the seminar series that have run over the last 3 or 4 years. We also do short conferences, and this one I didn't design, but I did actively participate in February, a really wonderful small conference called Small Data is Beautiful, and some really interesting discussions which came out of that. One of the things I inherited and I continued last year is also, I think, a really valuable program which matches postgraduate students in the arts faculty here at Melbourne with academics across the faculty who want to work on a digital project. I've got to say, when I came in, I was a little bit skeptical about this idea. We pay the graduate students for their time, and we pay for them to undertake some training in digital skills. I was skeptical because I really just couldn't understand how, giving people 5 or 6 workshops could really equip them to do something significant. And I've got to say, with my first direct experience of it last year, I've become a total convert to this model. It's really remarkable what young people can, the way they can rise to the occasion, as I say, with 4, 5, 6 workshops on different skills, working closely with an academic who supplies the data and the problem that they're working on. But in just about every case, really interesting things have come out of this, this scheme. I've put one of them up there, some interesting network mapping there, but a lot of these projects are up on our website. We house some major digital resources. The biggest of them is this Find and Connect project, hosting online information for people who are care leavers from state orphanages and other kinds of institutions. It's a really remarkable project which is funded by direct government grants. It's been going for numbers of years, and 3 or 4 people work on that. The other one, which we've become quite actively involved with last year, and I have had a lot to do with this, the Australian Women's Register, goes back 20 years. We are working actively. We've kind of adopted this major Australian digital data resource. We're re-platforming it currently, and we're going to make this something that will be housed in the digital studio and will have its own internship program attached to it. We support, as Natalia said, support high quality research when colleagues come to us. This is one example from the former director of the centre, Rachel Fensham, won a Community History Award. If you wanted to look at that later, it's a really wonderful digital data history project about a much loved small theatre just a few blocks from the university. And finally, this is the part that I've probably spent most of my time on, is just working out a program for the centre for the next couple of years. I spent a lot of time talking about how do we, I think our goal in the centre this year and next should be to continue working with the small minority of colleagues who are already at the cutting edge of digital scholarship, but we want to get more people involved. How do we do that? And I've got this idea about a pyramid of digital HAS training. At the top of the pyramid is the most expensive and unsustainable kind, where you give one-on-one assistance to a handful of colleagues who are seeking, competitive grant funding for a well-developed project. I think we've done that well in the past. I think we've done the bottom bit well in the past, which is introductory training in sort of larger groups. But I'm saying that I want the digital studio for the next year or two to spend a lot more time in the middle of the pyramid. How do we get people from down here to up here? And I've got some ideas about doing that in groups. I'm talking about groups of 3 to 6 colleagues who've got a shared digital ambition, and that we would use our resources, I'm saying, to take them on maybe a 3-month journey to increase their skills. So I will end the slideshow there. That's my 4-minute introduction to what we do. But again, I'm delighted to be here today.
Thank you so much, David, for explaining the research environment where the project was actually nurtured. And I think everybody can understand now in what privileged position I was, to develop these new computational tools, because I had so much support from this dedicated center developed to advance the academic field of digital humanities. So thank you for being such a great supporter on all the stages and in the future. And because we have a lot of new registered participants today, let me just step back right now and provide a very, very brief background of the project before I introduce you to the new mapping solution. In the beginning of 2018, I received an engagement research grant from the University of Melbourne and started to collaborate with the Australian Centre for the Moving Image to develop my pilot project, which was called Museum Soft Power Map. And this digital system offered a new computational research tool to explore contemporary museums and geography of their influence. So we mapped the diversity of academic collections and their audiences on the global map and their international networks with 180 institutions. And we also mapped their local audiences in Melbourne, as well as their traveling blockbuster exhibitions, and finally developed a new layer for local engagement power forecast for a new traveling Wonderland exhibition. While the project received many awards, it also revealed significant limitations in terms of the implementation challenges, and also it's a very, very narrow focus on just one museum. And addressing these limitations, we embarked on a completely new research journey to advance this pilot and develop a new mapping prototypes that employs the power of automation and machine learning to move the data aggregation process to a completely new level and to develop reliable interfaces to engage museum professionals in the process of mapping. So the new prototype that we are currently developing has only 3 layers. So far, we are planning to demonstrate 3 layers, and we already, exposed to your attention exploring digital collections layer. And today we will talk about the next one. So during our first webinar, we presented this, collection rich power layer that mapped the diversity of collections to calculate a potential appeal to different audiences. And during this event, we received a lot of valuable suggestions from our experts for the improvement of the prototype that we actually started to address in the development of our second layer that I'm happy to present to your attention right now. The layer provides a platform to aggregate museum verb and social media analytics, correlating museum data with open access census data. And it aims to expose areas on the global map where a museum enjoys greater digital attention, and where it requires further efforts to involve their online audiences. Before I actually show you the demo itself and the visualization, how it works, let's start with the mapping framework. And let me explain what is being visualized. So the second layer calculates digital or online engagement power index for each country on the global map, indicating a potential scope of audiences while highlighting the actual engagement happening in online museum spaces. So this index is a weighted sum of several normalized indicators based on two key types of data. On the one hand, it's institutional data, and on the other hand, it's open access data of different social demographic variables for each country. And the scale from 0 to 100 for each of these indices is calculated and interpreted in a linear fashion and not logarithmically. So first of all, this layer relies on the data collected by museums through Google Analytics. On Monday, when we ran our webinar devoted to challenges and risk in online communication environments, we had a really excellent discussion forum participant, professor from Malmo University, who raised very critical questions about Google Analytics. Specifically, she pointed out that Google Analytics has given us a lot of different numbers, and often these numbers are very difficult to make sense of. And she also stressed that usually this data give a promise of growth and expansion with new digital clicks and visits keeping coming to our attention. Indeed, our analysis of the data indicated that across all available data, the most valuable for our mapping project is only a geographic distribution of average session durations across such data as users, new users, sessions, bounce rate, pages per session, and the list goes on. Why, for example, counting users proves to be useless and misleading. Users are Google Analytics ways of defining unique visitors. Anytime a new visitor lands on a museum website, Google Analytics assigns them a unique ID. However, if the same visitor comes again using a different browser, he or she receives a separate client ID, and therefore Google Analytics would count it as two users already. So it's already skews the data. Moreover, while a user defined by Google is an individual person who has come to a website, we also have to acknowledge the bias generated by the bot traffic and Google in Google Analytics. It is non-human traffic to a website from spiders and robots that skews the aggregated data. In the end of the day, the data generated by Google Analytics needs to be cleaned and filtered to remove bot traffic from the calculation. In the metrics, all counts that show 100% bounce rate and zero average visit duration time. Time is critical here, it's the key. All this data needed to be completely eliminated to make sure that we deal with accurate engagement metrics. On the other hand, we also have to clean data from bias created by ghost spam, and because it hijacks Google Analytics ID and plops a fake visit to an analytics report. Bot traffic and ghost spam skew the data, and when it comes to mapping the data for each country, it appears that the United States always generates the largest engagement because in most cases, the unrecognized ghost spam is automatically mapped to the data generated by the United States. So these are things that are really critical when we deal with Google Analytics, and we have to be very, very careful. Another important component that constitutes the mapping is analytics collected from social media channels. Originally, we were planning to incorporate data aggregated via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, all the key channels are where museums usually communicate to their digital audiences. However, in the process of collecting the data, we ran into serious limitations. First of all, the most developed data API are provided by Google via Google Analytics and also YouTube Analytics, because YouTube belongs actually to Google and they have very similar API systems. They offer the most developed interface and a wide range of data, like already mentioned, among which we can actually choose something that could be really relevant. By contrast, Facebook, along with Instagram and Twitter, aggregates very poor analytics in relation to geographic distribution of audiences, which cannot be properly applied to the mapping framework. For example, only Facebook, among all three platforms, can offer access to geographic distribution of likes from the most engaged only 40 countries, 40. However, because API data access requires developed application to be submitted to them for their approval, on the prototype stage where we are now, this access to their API proves to be completely impossible. So addressing this limitation, we actually requested our partner museums to generate Excel spreadsheets with requested data from Facebook and Instagram. Unfortunately, the results are even more disappointing because the data could be generated only for 5 the most engaged countries, with the traffic constituting less than 30% of total engagements. So mapping this very narrow and limited data would be rather problematic and can create additional biases. So we hope that with time, these channels will develop more established kind of API channels to which we will finally get access, and they will, increase the quality of the data that they can provide to the researchers. In our prototype, the digital audience engagement data could be aggregated through 2 ways, either via API, which we are currently fine-tuning in collaboration with Museum Science Group, and via direct upload of CSV files. So specifically, we developed an interface that allows the system to access the analytics API via a provided link and extract relevant geographic distribution data to automatically map it through geovisualization. But also, if the Excel spreadsheet could be generated, transferred to this CSV files, and also, directly uploaded to the program. Another important criticism that was voiced during our previous events is that data analytics collected through program services is nothing without context. And to put the platform analytics data into the context, we correlate it with the audience profile in each country in terms of a potential audience scope and its digital mobility. And this data point to what extent audiences in each geographic location is able to interact with digital museum and its collection. The online engagement power layer visualizes such aggregated indices as potential audience scope and digital mobility. And the former draws on the population index based on the targeted total population number taken only for certain age groups from 10 to 55 years old and literacy rate. And the digital mobility index refers to the basic level of digital inequality and offers insights into the internet penetration rate and mobile usage index. The same way as in the development of the collection appeal power layer, these various social demographic variables data were aggregated from the open access data API from the World Bank, collected for the latest period. And of course, they can be easily updated on the next stages once the new data arrives. One of the most important requests that we keep receiving in all our public engagement is developing meaningful methodological tools of audience engagement, not only in terms of calculating this likes, clicks, or time spent on the site, but rather in terms of the changes in perceptions, sentiment, or valence. Indeed, if we look at the soft power conversion model of Joseph Nye, we can see that understanding audiences' perceptions is the most important component that can really tell us about impacts. And social media providers, provide a really perfect tool for recording of tons of qualitative data that can be aggregated to understand audiences, motivations, opinions, preferences, ideas. And this data can offer important insights that are valuable, especially in measuring museums of power to better understand the changes in public opinions. However, at the moment, we keep facing some significant challenges in mapping the public opinion that are worth discussing here. Specifically, there are 3 levels of difficulties that could be identified. First, the comprehensive and complete data aggregation. Second, ethical consideration. And finally, automatic analysis of data. In terms of data aggregation, it is important to discuss several limitations related to scraping textual qualitative data, such as audiences' comments from social media sites. While scraping this data from social media through API is technically possible, due to commercial value of the data, most of the major sources like Facebook or Twitter do not provide affordable and comprehensive data access. For example, both Twitter and Facebook offer very limited archiving capacities that create a bias towards working with the most recent data or data of the immediate past. And data sets obtained are not necessarily complete or selected in a traceable manner. Twitter's streaming API allows data to be accessed via filtering or by sampling. However, more than 10% of all Twitter accounts are private, meaning that their data is not shareable. Moreover, Twitter's default access level allows sampling of roughly to maximum 10% of all public statuses. So status messages on Facebook are also hard to obtain, which requires open authorization status from users. And furthermore, automatic aggregation of large corpora of social media data will make it very difficult to differentiate between posts produced by real people or cross-syndicated from different platforms or issued by spam bot networks. It is important to know how exactly the API pulls out posts to properly define the sample. Otherwise, we risk to produce desituated, depersonalized view of social action and process. And second, addressing ethical considerations is also very important. It is a common misconception about many online researchers who tend to treat online spaces as if the usual ethical rules do not apply. Furthermore, individual and cultural expectations of privacy, for instance, are very ambiguous and they change from community to community. People may operate in public spaces, but maintain very strong perceptions of expectations of privacy. And even public communication in specific contexts might imply restrictions on how it is used by others. While there are no standard approaches that may always be deemed ethical, what concerns a social media research, the main guiding principle is to understand the context and apply a situative approach that should arise directly from the specific practices and contingencies of the environment. However, this situative approach is very difficult to establish if we employ automatic aggregation tools to collect qualitative data. Finally, even let's imagine if we manage to aggregate qualitative data, a lot of them, minimizing ethical risks to harm our online audiences. The question remains, is it possible to dynamically and responsibly analyze high volume of qualitative data produced by museum audiences to extract meaningful insights? There are 2 ways how we can address this problem. On the one hand, we can employ a researcher to do that. In this case, we are dealing with a very limited sample, very small sample, a lot of time, which is required for such a task, and we need expertise in doing that. On the other hand, we can employ artificial intelligence and natural language processing tools. While we already know cases where museums employed this to analyze their audiences, they mostly use this kind of out-of-the-shelf solutions for natural language processing, which are not necessarily adopted to analyze museum audiences, which are, cultural audiences, not necessarily adopted for this commercial purposes, because these are very expensive solutions and usually produced for big businesses, and they're, kind of target their clients with a higher paying potential. So they create a lot of biases in understanding and, mapping perceptions of cultural audiences. Finally, we need to understand that human systems are incredibly complex and require appropriate contextualizations. When we deal with museum audiences, we need to consider not only social, political, economic, and historical context, but also linguistic, cultural, and religious. All these factors play an important role in defining online practices adopted by different audiences in their interactions with museums. For example, in my own analysis of the Virtual Museum of the Pacific social media platform developed by the Australian Museum to engage their source Indigenous and Aboriginal communities from across the Pacific, I learned that engagement I learned that no engagement at all or zero engagement could manifest a loud protest of the targeted audiences happening actually in the real life, not online. A silent protest, though, will not be visible for an artificial intelligence tool, but it can actually tell us a lot about the attitude, perceptions, and feedback of our audiences. There are NLP tools that it would be helpful to develop or, will really need to address this problem and deploy a so-called interpretive flexibility of platform grammars by assigning different meanings to online practices. First of all, understanding the context and meaning of these practices. And it's not an easy task, believe me. So before we move to the demo, let me conclude this kind of framework part by stressing two important innovative components that we managed to develop, especially in relation to the interface of data to power a prototype mapping solution. And first of all, we really addressed the challenge posed by Professor Lev Manovich during our previous webinar, who alerted that when we are creating these indices out of raw data, we risk to compromise the unbiased presentation of results. To make the process of data aggregation and analysis and visualization more transparent and accustomed to the needs of museums, we created an interface that allows a museum professional to make important decisions on all levels of data visualization, including selecting what raw data can be aggregating and how, creating formulas for data indices by giving a specific weight to different variables, compiling mapping layers on the basis of the aggregated data, as well as shaping visualization of different audiences depending on different purposes, as well as considering different access level to sensitive data. Moreover, we developed a new component that not only allows museum professionals to create specific views of their data visualization, but also compare this visualization by comparing different data cuts. Each of these data cuts is a specific subset of data aggregated and visualized according to a set of specific rules. It's actually a sample selected according to a particular criteria. And this could relate to a particular milestone or time period or a particular set of key events that require different visualizations for comparison purposes, or data representing different museum outposts or franchises. For example, in our visualization today, I will show you how we use this data cuts to create timeline for audience engagement for two museums from 2017 to 2021. And we also wanted to create data visualization data cuts for different museums that constitute the social science museum group, but unfortunately we could not obtain required data on time. But we will demonstrate this on the next iteration of the prototype development. Let me right now walk you through very quickly just the interface for the kind of back end, how it looks for a museum professional who wants to create their own visualization and what kind of activities he can go through to do so. So we log in here, and on the very top menu, you can see a lot of pages where you can visit. And let's start with the regular indices. Regular indices as actually the raw data, the basic raw data that you could collect. So you store and you put all this kind of list of these data sets here, and you can add new ones if you wish, and you can give them descriptions. For example, here you can see language diversity, Google Analytics, YouTube Analytics, all this data that will constitute our mapping. This is the raw data. The raw data, gives us some, important variables that help us to, build aggregated indices. And this aggregated indices is already a combination, is a weighted sum of normalized variables. So, and in each particular case, for example, you can add a new one if you want. And here you also add different raw data that you want to add and give the weight. For example, I created most recently this digital mobility, index, right? And I decided, okay, in my digital mobility, I want to use data from mobile usages. Internet penetration is important for me. Literacy is important, and population, right? And I put it, for example, all equal ways. However, I can change it to different ones if I want to, or I can add even more raw data here. For example, I don't know, maybe YouTube mentions I added here, and it will require, more input, so you can have 100% in total. So these are aggregated indices, which actually constitute layers. On the layer level, you do the same kind of work, but you decide what, and for example, we will, present to you today this online engagement power layer, right? So we will need to indicate which aggregated index is constituted, to what particular weight they have in this visualization. So it's all happening here. Again, you can add a new aggregated index, you can place them in different direction, you can give them different weights, and again, you can create as many layers as you want as a museum professional. And these data cuts, it's very simple and straightforward. So far, we use these data cuts for the data that we collected from 2017 to 2021. So again, it's very easy. You just create, maybe you create a different data cut, not if you're not, for example, interested in developing a timeline, but developing something else, you will be able to add another one. For example, online visits only. So, and finally, once you go through all this process from the very raw data to the layers themselves and different data cuts, you can constitute different views. Views is actual visualization that you will be able to share with different audiences. Each of this visualization has a specific key and can be open in the internet browser. You can send this link to different audiences. You can create different views, for example, for different types of audiences by adding visible data cuts. For example, if you don't want to, share all the years in the timeline, but only, for example, pandemic years, you can just put 2, or you can add even more. And visible layers. If you don't want to share all the layers in your visualization, but only one, here also is happening here. So you just add another view. It will assign a new key and a new URL that you will be able to use to share with different types of audiences. And here is the actual thing where you upload the raw data. Like I already announced, it could be done via API. For example, some of the data you don't need even to care to upload, because like population, literacy, internet penetration is automatically aggregated from the databases of World Bank. It's uploaded here and renewed once the new data comes. Some you can, and it helps with the link. You should know the API access link. Or if, for example, you don't have this API, for example, for your collections, things can be uploaded through a CSV file. or if you're not working with Google Analytics API, or you're, maybe accessing data that are difficult, then you can use all these different types of uploads. And now let me show you the visualization itself. So this is a science museum group. So when we come to this, we open one of this visualization link, the one that we created for the science museum group. And in the menu on the left, we can enable the online engagement power layer. On the right, we can, understand what raw data was aggregated indices and constitute this particular layer. And when you click across countries, it changes, and it will show us this data indices for each, level on this visualization. And on the very bottom, yeah, I forgot to say that we implied color coding, and the intensity of this red or orange kind of color indicates the majority of their audiences. So for Science Museum Group, we see a lot of engagement, some engagement happening in the Asia Pacific in terms of Australia highlighted, India highlighted, China is not that pale. If we go to Europe, I would say that apart from UK itself, the most engaged country is France, especially in the last year. And of course, United States popped up. So these are their audiences. So we are right now in 2021. But for example, if you go to France, right? So let me show you. So we started with France 2017, the index being 59. And then it moves to 61, 54. So it's actually fluctuates for each of the year. 56, not so much change from the last year, and a lot of change in the last year. So this kind of exploration allows us to see what is happening, across years. So, and here's the visualization for Asian Civilization museums. So again, we enable the visualization here, and we explore the data. So of course, for this museum, which is located in Singapore, the audiences, the majority of them come from the Asia Pacific, with a lot of, South Asia are highlighted, and still United States pops up. So, and UK is the most engaged country in Europe. So interesting thing that I noticed when I played with the visualization is about China. So when I started to put it from one year to another to visualize, I actually noticed that in 2020, it was like a huge spike in digital engagement in terms of their audiences, and drop down very drastically in 2021. So I would just would love to talk to Raymond more, who could maybe explain this situation with China, that in 2020 just raised so much and then dropped down in the next year. So here is the visualization. Let me now come back to my slides. I will finish in a couple of minutes. Let me just also explain something to you. Before I finish my demo, let me clarify some results that we generated through the comparing of engagement layers across different years on the timeline. You notice that when we switch from one year to another for both museums, we cannot see a lot of differences happening in terms of the color change on the map and in terms of their scores generated by each country for their online engagement power. So I anticipate your question, why do we have these results, which do not indicate a growth of digital audiences associated with the pandemic and lockdown times, right? Because indeed, in the past couple of years, many museums around the world reported a significant increase of their digital visitations, sometimes going to 150%. Do our visualizations show us that these two museums, participating museums, didn't increase their digital audiences. So no, absolutely not. And let me explain why. As we announced earlier, we do not expose raw data of museums through visualizations, and each raw data set upon aggregation is automatically normalized. So we are dealing with the normalized data, normalized and translated into index. And indeed, the raw data for both museums show the growth of online audiences across countries. However, according to the results of the mapping, this growth of the museum audiences in all countries, doesn't really affect the distribution of audiences shares. So while in absolute terms, we deal with the audience growth, in relative distributions of the shares, we see that museums did not diversify their audiences across countries, nor they really increased their digital engagement in particular countries in comparison to others. Also, considering that the main goals of this visualization exercise is to map and measure museum soft power in different geographic areas, depending on local challenges and opportunities, the results really correspond to these main objectives to highlight zones of maximum influence and areas of missed opportunities, while clearly demonstrating and comparing museum relational performance across different countries. So, and I would stop here and right now, let me invite to the floor our interactive evaluation panel. And all their participants who will share their critical feedback from their institutional, professional, and academic perspectives. And I hope that this conversation will create a space for us to reflect on the proposed solution, its design and usability. And today on the panel, we have Rosie Cardiff, and she's a website editor and digital audience research person from the Science Museum Group. Raymond Tham, Senior Manager of Digital Marketing at the Asian Civilization Museums in Singapore. Kathy Moffat, Head of the Sector Engagement Europe at Substrakt. And Nils Pokel, a Digital Strategist and Creative Consultant. The panel will be facilitated by Professor Corneliu, Bjola, and Professor of Diplomatic Studies and the Head of Digital Diplomacy Research Group at the University of Oxford. So Corneliu, the floor is yours right now. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Natalia, for the very comprehensive, insightful presentation of the new update of the model that you created. So I don't want to take too much time from the discussion with our panel participants. So I think what would be best at the moment to invite the panelists to comment on what you've seen. I think there are certain issues that have come up in terms of from your presentation, in terms of data collection, in terms of metrics to be used, what is relevant, what is less relevant. Also data aggregation, how data have to be put to work. And leading, of course, to the very interesting displays that you proposed in terms of visualizations. There are certain logical steps, and I guess our participants also have experience or have worked with the stages in various ways. So let me then, each participant will have about 5 minutes to comment on from their perspective, of course, and their experiences. And then we hope to we'll have another 20 minutes of questions and a Q&A session. Let me remind everyone, if you have questions for Natalia or for the interventions made by the 4 panelists, please post them in the Q&A session as we move forward. So I'll give the floor now to Katie. Katie, let me see. Are you here?
I am, thank you.
Okay, please. Sorry, my screen was a little bit. Please,
no, that's fine.
Yeah. So Katie, as
yes.
Natalia mentioned, head of the sector of engagement at Substrakt, a digital agency that works with cultural organizations in different places of the world. She is also, interestingly, a trustee for Abandoned Normal Devices. I love the title of the organization.
Yes,
Okay.
I am. Thank you very much, and thank you, Natalia, for interesting demo. I would say, first off, congratulations on developing such a tool. Working with such huge data sets is incredibly difficult, and I think lots of us will have seen tools that have been produced commercially that aim to, sort of review things like social media sentiment, and they are, it is difficult, let's just say. So I think it's a very interesting approach. So yeah, I work for a digital agency, Substrakt, and we work with a lot of arts and culture organizations, a lot of museums. Prior to that, I was at the Audience Agency, who are a UK-based not-for-profit that does a lot of research into audience behaviors, and there were particularly some interesting findings from a big piece of research that was done into digital behaviors over the last 2 years of the pandemic. I'll just talk about that very briefly in a second. In terms of the demo, I think it is a very interesting tool to help, really to help museums and cultural institutions, to remind them that online audiences are not just one homogenous group of people. I know that's probably a very obvious thing to say, but I think historically, if you go back some years, people tend to approach online audiences as all one type of person or people, or all one type of group. And of course, every people's motivations to engage, their interests, their behaviors vary hugely from country to country. And I think what a tool like this does is it helps people to start thinking much more about how audiences are differentiated between countries. It's obviously fairly broad in its consideration of audiences, in that it is looking very much at population level, but I think it is, as I say, a good starting point to think about kind of how you might take a differentiated approach. In reality, if you take a kind of one size fits all approach for online audiences, you tend to not get brilliant results. I thought it was interesting, Natalia, when you talked about the different data sources from Facebook and Instagram, and how Twitter's is very poor. That's always been an issue and continues to be. And I think, again, it would be interesting to explore more about what other types of data sources it might be useful to layer on top. Really to think about how different audiences on those platforms behave in perhaps different ways. Obviously, as well, in different countries, platforms like Instagram are more or less used depending on the country. I know Facebook is fairly ubiquitous. So I think I think really it's a great tool to help museums think about which countries might be the best sort of potential audiences for them to kind of target in terms of thinking about growth within that country. But of course, as I say, I would say you need to then layer on top of that either other sources of research, or perhaps conduct some of your own primary research that thinks about what are the motivations for those audiences to engage with your museum or cultural organisation. As I say, there's a very interesting piece of research done in the UK by the Centre for Cultural Value into the impact of COVID on cultural engagement. And some of that was about digital engagement. And it was UK based, but around 15% of the population during COVID indicated that they had browsed either a museum's online collection or an online archive So, you know, I mean, that was during COVID, but again, as Natalia said, what the other research also indicates is that COVID didn't really hugely increase the audiences that were engaging online. It just meant that the people that were already engaging did a lot more of it, and there is a huge potential there. So I think really just mention that in passing to say that there are lots of other interesting data sources and available research that you can kind of layer on top of a tool like this. But yeah, in summary, I think it's a great starting point to get GLAM organizations thinking about the differences between audiences and not approaching them all as kind of an online audience, which can be problematic for many reasons. So I'll leave it there and let my other panelists jump in.
Thank you very much, Katie. If I may, just press you a little bit more on this issue of audiences, because you've been working on this, for some time, audience development, research analytics as well. I've been wondering whether you can comment briefly on differences between offline and online audiences. What do we need to know when we look at online audiences? That is like, are they the same? What is different? How to capture that difference?
Really good question. Again, so what I think was fascinating about some of the research that was done during COVID, and again, we can't assume that it's exactly the same behavior because everybody was in a pandemic. But what a lot of that research showed is that actually the types of audiences that were engaging with cultural organizations online were largely similar in their makeup to the types of audiences that would engage culturally offline. So sometimes there is a perception that an online audience means that you are going to reach, very different types of people. That's not always the case in the kind of research I've seen. It does give you, of course, the opportunity to reach different geographic audiences and potentially different types of people that have physical access needs, maybe who can't. We found that with performing arts, a lot of people who are not able to physically attend really valued the live streaming that was happening a lot more during COVID, for example. But generally, the differences between offline audiences and online audiences in a cultural setting, and I am talking more, in terms of the research I've seen, sort of UK based, also mainland Europe, is that they are fairly similar. The types of people who are interested in, cultural institutions, in online collections, tend to be broadly similar, whether they're online and offline. Though there are some differences, around demographics, age, things like that. But I think we shouldn't make the assumption that an online audience is different to an offline audience. I can certainly share, for those people who haven't seen it, the links to the reports and the research that AHRC and the Centre for Cultural Value undertook, because there is it's an ongoing longitudinal study so it will be interesting to see how, once the pandemic has completely gone away, how audience behavior changes, and that is looking at offline and online behaviors. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you very much. I think probably we'll come back to that a bit later if there are questions from the audience. Let me move now to Nils Pokel, who is a digital strategist and creative consultant. He's based in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I hope I pronounced it correctly. And she is working with cultural organization locally and in Europe, with quite a broad experience across different museums, and had different positions over the past 10 years. His research is firmly grounded in human-centered design practices, and he very much interested in crafting meaningful visitor experiences. Nils, you have the floor. Let us know, please, how do you, from your perspective, how do you see the contributions that Natalia has put forward, but also your own projects as well, connected to this?
Thank you, Corneliu. Kia ora, everyone. And thank you, Natalia, for this overview and demonstration of this awesome tool that you're working on. I'm actually somewhat bummed that I haven't been part of the previous sessions to see the other layers that you have developed on top of this framework that you've put together. So I guess I'm looking, or I've looked at this tool with a fresh pair of eyes, obviously, and primarily looked at it from a usability perspective as a first-time user, and kind of seeing where I can see this fit into my practice, or what it would take, and where there are gaps from my perspective at this stage of the demo. So yeah, diving right into it. In terms of the front end, I think it looks beautiful. It's a really cool approach to amalgamate different data in a visually engaging way. I love the globe, but on my machine anyway, it is quite performance hungry, especially the clouds. And it seemed that this interactive model or mode of exploration wasn't really adding the functionality that would justify this extra resource that's required to render all of that. At least in the facet that I've been looking at, which was only online engagement power. So in that respective, I think it would be great to maybe have different worldviews to choose from to look at the layers. So maybe a flattened worldview, like the one in Google, I hate to say it, could provide a better usability in some instances, as it provides an at-a-glance view of the entire planet, and I can immediately see where there are hotspots and things that should command more of my attention. And related to that, I did wonder about, I guess, the audience for this tool in terms of, who's gonna be using this, because I understand it's primarily an in-house analytics tool that is made for professionals, so people who live and breathe spreadsheets and have data for breakfast. And I'm not sure if this sort of non-functional eye candy might be more interesting or engaging for public or layman audiences, as opposed to those people who live and work in spreadsheets. So from my perspective, I would have liked to have seen the ability to export different views of this, maybe list your stats of the online engagement power across. So I can integrate it with the other analytics tools and processes that I might employ. I also thought it would have been nice to see a global, so non-country specific engagement power score for my organization, just to kind of see as a benchmark baseline score, how am I tracking, and how are these other countries that I'm looking at correspond to that. And I guess there's a lot of stuff going on under the hood, which, in terms of the way the data is aggregated and weighted and so forth. And I thought in general, it would have been a nice addition to add a bit more contextual information as to what I'm looking at in places. So in particular, the aggregated indices I found were quite hard to comprehend for those who are new to the concept. So there was a bit of a, the challenge of a black box. I'm not quite sure how I end up with a certain score. And it's difficult to understand how these numbers are generated, as the weighting is not apparent in the front end view that I'm looking at. And the one that I was struggling most with was around the potential audience scope, which is kind of like your market size. So it's really important. But I found it quite intransparent to really understand how I reach a certain number. I mean, maybe it's as simple as just showing that as a mouse roll over that this has a weighting of X, so that I know how that value is generated. And I know that this is not the purpose of the tool, because if you've talked to that when we had our onboarding last week, but I would still be interested in seeing the possibility to have some sort of sector benchmarking to see how I'm tracking against other organizations. And maybe it would just be, a future option to share aggregated indices between partnering orgs. So we could say that the Science Museum and the Thinkbone Museum would like to share their data and see how they're doing in comparison to each other. There's a few little things around accessibility that I picked up on that I think would be just worth mentioning for future interfaces. I think the color coding and choice of colors doesn't really work for color blind people. So maybe there would be the possibility of having a higher contrast view. Personally, I found the subtle changes in the hue quite hard to distinguish. So I would have probably preferred a banded color scale, which would have been easier to read. Yeah, and then in terms of the back end, only from what I've seen last week and in your presentation here is that I guess the authoring process appears to be quite complex at first look. Because there is a whole lot of work and thinking that needs to happen in terms of what indices I bring in, how I weight them, which I think could be seen as quite daunting. So, in terms of what is best practice, how do we even know what is important to me or my organization, and how, what do I need to put in to get something that's meaningful for what I'm after? So maybe there is a place for standard settings that are just baked in and can't be weighted, say for digital literacy, for those API values that you bring in, which would also mean that those things would then become more easy to benchmark and compare with other different organizations. So last one, sorry, yep. I think in terms of the big question that I had going away from it, and Katie's touched on that, is how do you make these insights actionable? So I still think there is a gap around, what's next. Okay, I can see that I have different scoring across the globe, but how do I then increase that impact, assuming that that's my goal? Is there a place for maybe implementing what-if scenarios? So if I increased online visitation from that country by 50%, what would that do to my impact score for that given country? Yeah, but all in all, I think it's a great start and it looks really awesome, and I can't wait to see what else comes out of it.
Thank you very much, Nils. And these are very useful, and I think, Natalia already has taken notes of all this advice that you have provided. I mean, just a quick point, just drawing on your experience assisting, with digital advice and strategic advice. The question of visualization, you mentioned something at the beginning, and I think it's quite relevant. I've been wondering, there is a debate, academic debate, going about how we accept visual inputs depends very much on the cultural filters that we use. I've been wondering whether you can comment on this. Is it sometimes maps are misleading, sometimes other facts. I've been wondering whether what do we need to know, what do we need to keep in mind when you produce or propose visualization in terms of how it travel, this visualization, how they can travel well from a cultural perspective across different regions. Do you have any tips for us?
Ooh, that's a really good and meaty question. It's hard to say. I have to come back to you on that. Actually, I don't have any hot tips right off the press that I could give you that are in universal design language that works for everyone. Yeah.
Sure. We'll come back to this later if we have time. Of course, let me turn now to Rosie Cardiff. She's a website editor for the Science Museum Group. She's been overseeing the development of websites for 5 museums in that particular, including the Science Museum in London. She has been involved also in conducting research to understand digital audiences and how they use their website. So in a sense, it's a particular angle that I think, it's very much relevant to Natalia's prototype. So Rosie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Natalia. And yeah, we found it very exciting and interesting looking at this new way of sort of visualizing our data, and there were some surprises and some things that were sort of not so surprising. I guess the main thing at first was that a lot of the colors on the map kind of correlated with what we'd expect to see from our Google Analytics in terms of where most of our traffic comes from, the UK, the USA, India. We kind of knew that already, but what was quite interesting when you see that Google data correlated with the open source data from the World Bank is these sort of pink areas. China was one, Brazil was another. These areas where there's actually a large potential audience scope, high countries with quite high, large populations, quite high digital literacy, where we might be able to sort of reach more people in those countries. So that was quite exciting as a way to sort of look at the data and sort of think, oh, why aren't we reaching more people in China? Obviously, we have a collection that's rich in technology and science, and what are the barriers there? Another side to it was looking at how those colors hadn't changed much over time. I think maybe you'd expect to see some sort of changes reflected during the pandemic, but in that, I think our experiences very much matched what Katie was talking about, in that we did see a large increase in traffic to our website. We did see an increase in our online audiences, but it was always the same core audiences that we'd always been reaching. So when we've conducted our own research into our digital audiences, we've seen very much the same thing that Katie was talking about, which was that we have this core audience. It's generally quite highly educated. In some cases, it's quite localized to the museum. And they were very much engaging with us while the museums were closed. And now that we've reopened, they're once again coming through the doors and engaging with us online. And one of the key questions that comes out of this research and the sort of data visualization is, how do we actually diversify our audience? How do we reach the people that we're not currently reaching, and what steps could we take? And I don't think this tool has the answer exactly, but it does sort of show the potential for audiences in other countries, and where these people might be who are not currently reaching. So that I found very interesting. One of the other things it reinforced, I think it was a shame in a way. Obviously, the restrictions on the social media APIs meant that we couldn't get Facebook and Twitter data and things. But on the other hand, YouTube is actually one of the channels that we're really interested in at the moment, and thinking very much about how we could reach a much wider, larger audience through YouTube, and this tool very much showed that there's a lot of potential there, and we're kind of not reaching people in many countries on YouTube, and maybe we could be. So if we put some effort in on our YouTube channel, there's obviously a massive potential there to reach a much larger global audience. And a few other thoughts around the tool were that it would be really exciting to sort of have both of the layers on the map. I mean, I was just looking at the sort of digital online engagement, but obviously in the previous round of the project, there was a mapping exercise, mapping your collection on a global scale. And it would be great to have both views, because it'd be really interesting to see, oh, how my collection is over here, but my audience is interacting over here. I think that would be quite an interesting comparison. Another thing that Natalia mentioned was this segmentation of data. One of the things we'd be quite keen to do is look at how the data changed, not so much over time, but for each of our museums. We've got 5 museums in our group, so it'd be interesting to see how Science Museum London data compared to, say, the National Railway Museum in York. So I thought there was a lot of potential there to get some really interesting findings and quite, you know, exciting revelations from the tool.
Thank you very much, Rosie. You know, very insightful comments as well, and were quite relevant for the prototype, for the new updates. If I may pick a little bit on this point that you mentioned at the end, the segmentation of the data. And the reason I want to do this is my own research, which is focused mainly on digital diplomacy, how Ministry of Foreign Affairs use various social media networks, you know, to reach their audiences. One problem, one challenge for them has been the volatility of the audience, the fact that they form around issues. They are not very stable. I mean, the online audiences, they come and go, so to speak. So that creates a challenge, because if you want to engage with the community, then the community forms and then disappears. It comes back, it may come back, it may not come back. So it very much depends on the topic, on the theme. Have you seen this issue of volatility? Have you seen it in your data? Is it a fact? Is this happening also for cultural museums online? Because in terms of, you know, community building, I think that's an issue that is particularly relevant for bringing back the audiences, staying engaged with them over time, not only on a particular exhibition. Any thoughts on this?
I guess one of the differences in terms of our digital activity is museums are also physical spaces. So I think we've seen less of that volatility in a way, in that we've tended to have a slightly different thing, that is that our online audiences in many ways reflect our physical visitors. So it's less that they're a sort of volatile audience that are sort of shifting, and more that it's with, in some cases with some of our museums, it's actually quite a local audience. It's people that know the museum on social media. There's a much, you know, it's quite likely that they've visited our museum in the last year if they're engaging with us on social media. They sort of know our physical spaces as well as our sort of online presence. And actually, maybe for us, we'd quite like to reach some of those more volatile audiences, the people that might not be planning a visit and might not be in our country and might not be coming to our museum, and that can sometimes present a bit of a challenge for us. We're always sort of speaking to the same people, and how do we diversify that is one of our sort of challenges.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Let me now move to our last panel participant in panel speaker in this panel, Raymond Tham. He's a senior manager, digital marketing at the Asian Civilization Museum in Singapore. It's been working for the past 10 years as a market professional across several industries. He's handled more recently the working at a digital agency and also handled digital outreach for Singapore's third largest media outlet. So happy to have you with us, Raymond, as well. Been wondering your views on based on also your own perspective on how do you think this prototype, what are the strengths, the weaknesses, what kind of advice you like to provide as well.
So thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. Raymond, as mentioned, from the Asian Civilisations Museum in Singapore. We're a relatively young museum. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary in just a few weeks from now. And I think our digital efforts, in fact, is at an even younger stage. So we only had a website like less than 10 years ago. We only had a YouTube channel for 3 years ago. So we're going through a digital evolution ourselves. And we're looking at all the data that we can to kind of see how we can implement different efforts into this. So, when I think about data and data visualization, particularly as part of my work in any organization, whether it was in a bank in the past or at a media outlet, I think about how we can use the data to improve ourselves or any learnings that we can take away for the future. I think visualization is very important. Even though I'm a data person, I like looking at the spreadsheets, I like looking at the numbers and kind of pulling out insights from them. Visualization obviously is very important when dealing with our stakeholders, our CEOs, our board directors, because they also need to know how everything is going and they also need to give their own insights. So I think the visualization here was very useful in that way in terms of getting new ways to visualize our data to our board directors rather than showing them pure numbers. But I think one of the ways we can improve obviously is customizing how we do the visualization, because I'm a bit concerned sometimes, some of our board directors are in their late 70s. They can't really use the computers really well. So there's ways to customize visualizations or even look at the accessibility of information to make it visually more appealing for them, getting the font, changing the font size, the colors, all these are quite important for visualization and data visualization in my head. In terms of insights I got from here, I think some of the insights, like I think a previous speaker mentioned, Rosie mentioned, was that things that we already knew before. That, for instance, a lot of our digital visitors corresponded with our physical visitors, mainly from our largest tourist segments from China, Indonesia, India, as well as a bit from the UK and the US. But when you put it on the map this way, I think hopefully it'll be clearer for my director and my board members that, we have not seen too much of a change over the years. Maybe there are areas where we want to improve. Maybe there are areas that we hope that even during this pandemic, we can maintain our strong viewership. And Singapore is a very small country and, we rely a lot on tourists to come to Singapore. So even without the tourists coming to Singapore during this pandemic, we still see a large amount of people from overseas visiting our website portal. So that's quite crucial for us at one point. And I think one of the insights that I gained from here, at least from the visualization, and it can be very clear to all our stakeholders, whether it's me or our board members or even the rest of the staff here, is how we also need to ramp up efforts in certain countries. Like our neighboring country, I was very surprised, obviously, when I looked at the data and with the visualization, that our closest neighbor, Malaysia, which we are just a bridge away from, had a very low traffic or a very low score than Malaysia. And this is our closest neighbor where we share a lot of cultural similarities, a lot of people similarities. We actually cross the border almost every day. We have a lot of family members from across both nations. So it's a very starking that we see Malaysia being very low in this count. And it's something, therefore, the learning for us is to continue to ramp up some of our efforts there, which we have not really done compared to a country like Indonesia, which is also our second closest neighbor. I think Natalia earlier mentioned about our data in China, how it improved in 2020. And in fact, I had to go back because I only joined ACM 3 months ago. So I had to go back and look at our data from the past, what happened in 2020, do my own literature research into what happened in 2020 that sort of jump in China and how they decreased. So I mean, the reason for that jump, and this is probably a hypothesis, is that year we had partnered with the National Museum of China to do an online campaign during COVID-19, where it sparked some 100 million views in China alone for some of our content. And I assume that will lead to some interest from China into our platform. And also in the same year, we sent some 168 treasures from our Tang Shipwreck exhibition to China. I think our Tang Shipwreck exhibition has always traditionally been our most popular exhibit among our Chinese visitors, both physical and online, as it came from the 9th century and is the biggest single collection of Tang Dynasty artifacts found outside of China. So it was during that year, it happened in the same year as well. So I think that just to answer Natalia's future question on this, it'll be good. What I think will be extremely useful in the future is, of course, I think alluded to by Nils in part earlier and also by Rosie, is of course comparing ourselves to our other partners, because ACM is part of the National Heritage Board, which controls most of the museums in Singapore. So comparing ourselves and seeing how our efforts are doing compared to the other museums, learning from them, and also learning from other museums around the world. I think that museums around the world have traditionally worked very closely with each other on various matters. You know, we share artifacts, we have traveling exhibitions to each other museum, but we do not have a large scale information sharing about the digital space. And I hope like a tool like this, a forum like this can help us to achieve that in the future, because there's a lot for each of us to learn from each other in the digital world. And I think that the actionable steps should be taken in this data visualization on why is one museum doing better than another museum in this part of the world, even if it's not just geographical. Like in Singapore, let's say I'll compare ourselves to the Malay Heritage Center. Maybe it's doing better in Malaysia. Why is it doing better in Malaysia? I would like to know that as well. And I think it will help to improve our processes along the way as well. So thank you. And thank you for doing up this data visualization. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Raymond. Again, you know, quite insightful experiences and advice that you offered, Natalia. One thing I think, building on a point that was mentioned by Javier in the chat room, and thank you, Javier, Adrian, and Nils, you know, for your comments in the chat room as well. So Javier is, I mean, I think his question is quite to the point here in terms of, since we've discussed so much about the fact that, you know, the offline and online audiences to a certain extent overlap. Javier asked the point, what kind of attraction metrics shall we think about attracting, you know, new audiences, especially online audiences? So I'd be wondering, Raymond, any thoughts on that? So additional attraction metrics that might be used to have relevance in terms of the data that is being collected in a way to expand, right? To diversify, as Rosie mentioned, from the core group that you already are familiar with.
I think the one thing, at least when I was working at a bank, you know, we always looked, and mine was a cross-regional bank. So we looked at how much engagement we had and in the engagement rate we had. So across the population, across certain interest groups within the bank, to see what, across the region, to see what different people and how we have to keep on consistently changing towards drawing more interest into signing up with the bank. So I think you can apply that with museums as well to see how much content, whether your content, your website is engaging to the readers, and see how you can build from that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. On the same point, is anyone else from the panel would like to comment about the attraction metrics that need to be considered? Either Nils or Rosie or Katie.
Just one thing I would just say is that I think what you find with any sort of metrics like this is you have kind of data that is available via, you know, things like Facebook and Google Analytics that gives you you know, quite general, quite generic type data that is useful to a degree. But as I was saying earlier, I always find that I think you have to layer onto that. Usually, if you really want to understand, am I reaching different audiences, new audiences, who are they, what are their motivations, etc., you normally have to to do some kind of primary research yourself, maybe, you know, start with a benchmark and then repeat it in 6 months, whether that's surveying, whatever you're doing. I think I don't think there is there is a kind of either one sort of data source that gives you that intel, or equally something that is relevant for all types of organizations in all types of situations, because it is by its nature quite complex. So I think usually even if it's quite you know, fairly simple primary research that into who your audiences are now, so that you can understand who they're not, you know, and like who you might want to reach. I think usually that's what you need to do. So
thank you very much, Katie. So I think I'm going to stop here. I think that the question of audience is quite interesting. Again, drawing on my own work on digital diplomacy, what I found interesting, I don't know whether it has a lot of relevance for this particular debate in the cultural field, but what I found interesting nowadays in Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they are asking themselves, what is the audience now? 10 years ago, it was on social media. You know, some of the interesting projects that I've seen recently with the State Department, and not only, is that they are looking at the gaming community, 3.5 billion people in the gaming community. So this is what the audience, a different type of demographic. And that, of course, invites some questions about how to approach that community from this perspective of the cultural field. But with that thought, I think I'm going to stop here and move on, because Natalia is going to get upset with me again because I always go over my time, and invite Laura to chair the third section of our webinar today, which is the discussion forum. So Laura, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Corneliu. And I'm delighted to be part in this wonderful event and to facilitate discussion with our next 4 panelists, who will focus on digital audience engagement. And I think their presentations will complement really well what we've heard so far. Similarly to the previous panel, each panelist will have 5 minutes for their presentation, and then we'll have questions. So without further ado, I would like to invite Adrian Kingston, Head of Digital Channels in the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarewa, to present his observations.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. I'm just going to, I do have some slides. I have way too many, but I'm going to share them anyway. It's been really interesting listening to this because it means that I can, I think, focus a bit more on some of the content that I have that's relevant to what we've been talking about. So just very quickly on me. So I'm Head of Digital Channels. I've been at Papa for 20 years in a variety of roles. A lot of them are around getting our collections out to digital audiences, but we won't dwell on that for too long. For those of you who don't know much about Papa, we are the National Museum and the National Art Gallery and the National Natural History Museum. So our collections span pretty much everything except geology. We are in Wellington, New Zealand, which has a population of around 400,000. We've got around about 2.5 million collection items. A lot of people think of us as new, but we were actually founded in 1865, the first museum, I think, in the country, through a variety of various organizations. We have a bicultural leadership model, which is super important to us because the Treaty of Waitangi, the understanding of the relationship between Māori and those who came after Māori is very important to us, including the Mana Taonga principle, which is a principle that reflects the fact that we recognize that the collections, the taonga that we hold, are not ours. They reflect the people that they come from, and that they are not, the collections are not dead, they are alive, and they are telling the stories of the people that they come from, but also the people that are around now. And that's a really big part of how we think about our collections. We're 50% government funded, 50% self-funded, which has been really hard during COVID. And we are very proud of saying we're the most visited museum in Australasia. Of course, a lot of that is pre-COVID, so there's some caveats to some of that. But we do still like to say that to our Australian partners. So one of the things that I've been doing in the last 10 years, but had success in the last 3 years, is actually promoting the idea of the importance of our digital visitors, because we really have clung to that success of our physical visitors as the National Museum. To have a year of 1.8 million visitors to the museum in a city of 400,000 is pretty significant. So it's a flag that we wave a lot. So what I spend a lot of time doing is saying, but our digital audiences are actually as relevant, and we reach a lot more of them, and we reach across a much greater geographic area. So in the last 3 years, I've been telling a lot about the story of the digital museum, and the fact that if you look at the graph that we've got going on here, that of the 3.7 million visitors that we had to our websites in 2021, 76% of them were to the digital museum. The assumption has been in the past that most of the people who have visited our museums in the past are planning a visit to the building, which is simply not true. That's around about 9.7, so considerably different. COVID was really interesting, I think, it's been talked about a lot, and it was a great way of thinking about how we can amplify the extra exposure. I think there's been some discussion around physical and digital, and one of the things that, even though I've been trying to highlight the importance of digital visitors, is I actually don't believe that we can work in isolation, and the way that we're going to succeed with digital visitors is to see them as part of the spectrum of visitors that we reach through a number of channels. On the right, sorry, you'll see a little bit of a diagram that I use to communicate this. Unfortunately, it's called dots and lines. We haven't come up with a better name, but it shows how we engage with different visitors around a particular topic over time through digital channels, and that none of these channels actually exist in isolation. So that's a little bit of a, I guess, a base for the way that I talk about these kinds of audiences. So I spent a long time trying to do some storytelling around some of these kinds of things, but we really are moving away from the idea of numbers, as has been talked about a lot. I also just want to touch on the fact that our physical numbers are also incredibly skewed and biased. We have taxi drivers using our public toilets a lot. We have people coming and going through the front door a lot, and they are counted multiple times. And I find it really interesting that we put more scrutiny on our digital counts than we do on our physical counts. But that's kind of a side point. But there is definitely more opportunity and more reach for the idea of digital. Of course, there are many barriers as well when we think about the idea of digital literacy and various digital barriers. But I think one thing that is possibly of interest and has been talked about a little bit so far tonight is the idea that the data that you gather needs to be more than just the Google Analytics and the data that you can get from the various platforms that exist. And this is something that Katie has touched on. So we are lucky in that we have been running a number of our own surveys, bespoke surveys, in the various platforms that we have for a number of years. So when we launched an open access image download project in 2014, we included a survey because we knew it was going to be really important. We wanted to know what people were using the images for. We also run, and so we've actually got a really good response from that, because there's a very high value exchange with these audiences, because they are getting something that they want. So they are giving us information back, and they're telling us some very personal stories. So we have thousands of qualitative, real human stories per year. We also have been running Hotjar for a number of years, which is another pop-up survey where we ask people, what are they using the site for? Are they satisfied? And to give us, again, some more qualitative human-based stories. We also monitor social media. We also reach out to our networks, the people that we're working with, and ask them for feedback as well. So that's teachers, communities that we're working with, etc., etc. So we've got a huge amount of data. But what's actually more important, and again, this has been touched on, is we're focusing less on that generic level of evaluation and more on understanding our priority and underrepresented audiences. So we began research into Māori audience needs in 2018. And because, again, we focused very much in the past on our physical visitors, the small pilot phase piece of research that we did focus on, if you were going to come to Papa, what would you be interested in? But we were still able to take some findings from that we were able to apply online, such as the fact that Māori are very interested in more movement, more sound, less words, less still images, less things behind glass, something that we were actually able to apply to thinking online. In 2020, we started asking through our Hotjar surveys, something that we're quite worried about was ethnicity, and thinking about whether we were actually finding out more about Māori Pacific audiences, because we really didn't know much, and that this was about setting that baseline. We're about to enter into some more research into the Pacific community across all channels, what it is that they're expected with. We're about to do some joint research with Archives New Zealand and National Library on the use of te reo on our websites. And we're going to be doing more of this focused research rather than the generic evaluation we were talking about before. I realize I've gone over time already, but I think this is probably one of the most important parts of what we have found. So Māori make up 17% of the New Zealand population. Pacific peoples make up 7.4. We kind of get that for our physical visitors, but actually when we look at the program that we offer, our blockbusters are things like the Surrealist exhibition that we had last year. And if you look at the Māori representation of people who are interested in that, it is tiny. But when we look at the Māori representation of the people who are visiting our websites for Māori specific content, it is way overrepresented. The same with Pacific. This is actually reflected with what happens on the floor as well. So there is big differences between what we do on floor and online for our different audiences. One of the things that we're starting to realize is that we do not need to worry about Pākehā, which is New Zealand European audiences, so much because we serve them so well already. We need to think about our underrepresented audiences. So that includes not only ethnographic or cultural audiences, but also other underrepresented groups like LGBTQI+, people who speak different languages, people with disabilities, those kinds of things. And we're learning more and more about them and trying to serve them digitally when we can't necessarily do that on the floor. The tool that we use that I'm not going to go into now is the audience impact model, but a big goal about that is going beyond numbers into actually, and what we know as vanity metrics, and often quite incorrect, but going into understanding where learning and change and impact actually come in on. I can spend 60 minutes talking about the audience impact, so I will not do that now. Another thing is thinking about audiences not just being passive, and actually thinking about more about community and who it is that we work with, and we're thinking about what that spectrum looks like compared to the general community or general audience. And then what we're doing is we're really gathering real stories of actual human impact. And these are the things that have made the biggest change in the way that our leadership team and our board understand how it is that we reach our audiences and the impact that digital has. And as Katie was saying, it is not just a generic audience. There are specific people, specific ways of slicing them with specific needs, and they are doing all kinds of things across the country that actually have an impact on the communities that they work with or on their own personal lives. And this is what we want to do more and more of. And I'm sorry, that was way over, so I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for such an insightful presentation. It's really wonderful to see the level of care and research that has been put into this project. And I would like now to move on to our next panelist, who is Amanda Solomons. She's a marketing manager at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Australia. Amanda, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm the marketing manager, as mentioned, at the Museum of Contemporary Art Australia, which we also refer to as the MCA. Firstly, I would actually like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm joining you from and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional landowners of the land that I'm standing on today. So I pay respects to elders past, present and future. The MCA is located in Sydney, for those who don't know, and this is an image of our building with a lovely artwork by an artist called Lindy Lee, shining in the front. We are Australia's leading museum dedicated to exhibiting, collecting and interpreting the work of today's artists. We have a collection of around over 4,000 works by Australian artists, and our vision is to make contemporary art accessible to as many audiences as possible, essentially pushing out the message and inviting everyone in, because we believe that art is for everyone. From a digital perspective, we're always looking at how we engage our audiences and understand them better. And as we're focused more so on deepening engagement within the digital and the physical experiences of the museum. So today I'm actually going to focus on one project in particular, because we do a lot of different things at the museum. And it's a project called Your Feelings Welcome, which I think touches on a very different element to what has been discussed today. And this actually looks much more into quantitative research rather than, qualitative research rather than quantitative research. And I think it'll provide a different perspective, which might be interesting for this evening's, or for my case, this evening's discussion. So the project came to fruition. It took about 1.5 years to get it into fruition, but in May 2021, which was a pretty difficult period. It was the sort of the breathing space between 2 lockdowns in Sydney. So it helped us to measure the number of visitors, their engagement and their time spent in the museum in a COVID environment while the city was open. It's also a case study into how to use data to make people feel like they're part of something bigger. The project grew from the insight that contemporary art can inspire, surprise, empower, challenge, and make us think, but these emotions are often internalized and they're not expressed. So we were looking at whether we could make the physical and the digital museum experience collide, and could we use it as a chance to get data and do some research in a slightly different manner. So we started to think about what if visitors were able to express how artworks made them feel, and find out how others reacted to, and we decided we would use a universal language, one that can be a little bit controversial at times, but we decided to use emojis. So we got people to use our web app, which is you can access on any mobile device. And we invited visitors to share their feelings about artworks. In our permanent collection, you can see a few works there in a fun and accessible way. So essentially this project was at the crossroads of personal and collective and digital and physical. And it feeds on visitor practices that are normally opposed. So where online you can like something, you can comment on something, you can engage with it in that way, we looked at how we could incorporate that into the physical experience of a museum. So we essentially created another space for visitors to express their thoughts about artwork and give us greater insights into them that were really valuable for marketing, but also really priceless insights for our curatorial team, our public programming team, and our leadership team. So when walking through the MCA, visitors could react to the artworks display. They would scan a QR code, they'd access the artwork page on their device. They might be able to also learn more about the artwork, so access a video or some additional content about it. And then they were invited to leave an emoji to express how they were feeling. And depending on the emoji that they selected, we would ask them a question. We would then publish these responses throughout the building. So they went through our digital signage, they went through a marketing campaign as well, which went through the city. So they were also delivered a personalized clip when they left, which captured their feelings, the artwork that they'd experienced, and the kind of the insights that they'd found themselves using. So pivotal to this was a suite of 18 emojis, which we designed and created with our design studio. And we did this in consultation with a number of different user groups as well. So we did it with our First Nations advisory group. We worked with different groups for accessibility, such as our deaf community and our queer community as well. So this was all accompanied by a data-driven marketing campaign, as I mentioned, which went through the city and used what we were finding about people and artwork to push through our marketing campaign, which was across outdoor and social media as well. So overall, it provided us with greater insights in regard to audience engagement. We ran this for around 4 weeks in the museum because lockdowns limited us, but we had a total of around 3,000 people using the app, and 654 took away a personal kind of a visit memento, so how they, what artworks they saw, etc. We had 791 comments, 1,789 emojis, which we thought was quite interesting. So our marketing campaign reached around 4 million people. So this was using the content that we created further out. And these were the sorts of feelings that we saw people experiencing through the museum. So we saw that they were feeling love for a lot of artworks. The artwork was making them feel thoughtful. It was making them feel inspired. It was making them feel magical and deadly, which is a term that is a Aboriginal term for, it means exactly that, deadly, awesome, fantastic. It's a really wonderful word, which we love. And these were just some of the artworks that we included. We used a portion of our collection, and we actually cleared the use of this with all the artists involved as well. And what I wanted to also share with you was that we engaged more people used the app than had done previously. But what was also really interesting was by mixing this combination of physical and digital, people actually stopped and viewed artwork about 11,000 times. Like, there was more people stopping at different artworks because we measured that on our web app as well. And we also had a massive increase in our dwell time in terms of people spending more time with artwork and stopping to reflect. And what I will sort of show you now is some of the comments that people left. And it was very interesting for us because we were looking at it from a bit of a data perspective. We were curious as to, how we normally ask people where their demographic style questions, where they're from, what age they are. We try to get a picture of them in that way, but we were trying to understand how they do actually connect with our artwork and what they actually take away from experiences. And so this was really, really interesting. This is a particularly beautiful work by some artists in the Martu area, an Indigenous area in Australia. And you can see that this work is a stunning work, and it's a protest piece. And we saw people really connecting with what that work meant. And there's some comments there that you can read through. We saw people connecting with lots of different artworks, and I've shared this presentation, and you can read these in your own leisure as well. But you can see, there was a lot of different levels of engagement, which we thought were really, really interesting. So what we're doing at the moment is we're actually evaluating what this means and having this sort of information and these sorts of insights. So what we're looking at now is we're also building our qualitative research, and what we're trying to do is match these two things up, and that's a bigger data project for us to take our more traditional research insights and match up what we're doing in a more quantitative space. So that is what I wanted to share with you today. I hope that it was interesting. I know it's a little bit different to some of the things we've been talking about today, but I hope you enjoyed your trip through the MCA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and I really enjoyed this presentation and how fun and engaging this project was. I also particularly liked the way that you did this in consultation with different groups. I think consultation is really important as part of it. Is the Senior Manager Audience Research and Insight at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London.
Perfect, great, thank you. So I'm going to talk about some research we've done into young people's use of social media to inform our new museum. So I'm from the Victoria and Albert Museum in South Kensington in London, and we are expanding. As part of that expansion, we're developing a brand new museum called V&A East. Modelled on the design of a Balenciaga dress, V&A East will be a new and exciting space for celebrating makers and making and exploring why people make things. Opening in 2025, it'll be located in the former Olympic Park in Stratford, East London, as part of the redevelopment of that area into a cultural hub. At the heart of the V&A East project is a mission to transform access to the V&A's world-class collection by engaging audiences that represent London's diverse community, by collaborating with local boroughs and targeting a young demographic. We want our audiences to mirror the diverse communities we're part of in East London. Between 45 and 71% of residents in our most local boroughs are from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. We also want to super serve young people. We anticipate that the majority of the audience visiting will be from under 35 years of age. So to do this, we wanted to identify, explore, and understand the social media habits and behaviours of this younger, underrepresented V&A East audience. So specifically, how does this audience use and interact with social media? What defines exciting and engaging social media contents for them? Where do their online interests and our content areas overlap? And how can we use this to launch a new marketing strategy for the new site? So we used an external research agency called Kindling to recruit 10 friendship pairs from the target audience and invited them to take part in a series of video tasks via WhatsApp. We asked participants to create videos about their relationship to social media, their interests, what makes a good offer on social media, and we followed this up with some paired interviews to explore this in more detail. And we ensured we had representation from 16 to 24-year-olds from ethnic minorities who were living in the local area and were active on social media. And this research showed that there were clear differences between the uses of different platforms. So Snapchat was used for messaging with close friends first thing in the morning, but was kind of something they'd all grown out of by the age of 21. Facebook was used to keep in touch with family, mainly in the evening. Twitter to keep up to date with news. YouTube was about learning through following how-to videos, and TikTok was all about enjoyment and winding down in the evening. Instagram was the most universally relevant of all the social media platforms. It had the broadest appeal and the everyday relevance across age, gender, segments, and interests. It's seen as entertaining without being quite as addictive as TikTok. It's a relaxing experience, a way of tuning out without completely switching off or zoning out. And it was the platform they were most happy to engage with throughout the day. And Instagram encompassed the broadest range of purposes and types of engagement. It's sharing memes with friends, seeing what your friends are up to, where they've been, connecting with your interests, so following musicians, artists, cooks, and brands. It's learning about the latest events, getting an insight into the lives of celebrities, and getting influencer inspiration. Unfortunately, though, young audiences have low expectations of museums on social media. Most expected the V&A East social media feeds to be dull. Not because they think the V&A is dull, but because that's what they would expect of all museums on social media. They see museums as stuck in the past, irrelevant to their personal lives, showing objects without context, being educational rather than entertaining, and lacking in dynamism. And they assumed this is what they would see on social media. So instead, our social media feed needs to put people before things, use pictures, not words, so objects that are styled rather than just showing style, and show creators rather than makers. At the V&A East, we need to go and get them. We need to grab their attention in their feeds because they're not going to come to our Instagram page. The way they will see us is through people posting pictures of their experience at the museum or sharing our content on their pages. And to get into those feeds, fundamentally, it comes down to this. Does it pass the toilet seat test? Will our content engage people while they're scrolling on the toilet?
Thank you very much, Marie. This is really wonderful, and I really look forward to the new museum and to see how you develop it and how you've engaged with new audiences. And I'm now turning to our last presentation by Doug Newton-Walters, who is the Digital Engagement Manager at the National Film and Sound Archive.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to say before I start that I'm coming to you from Gundungara land, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and see their value as part of a rich and vibrant living Indigenous range of cultures. Now, I am just going to open up my notes. It's been amazing hearing everybody talking through this. I feel like I'm surrounded by people that I should be talking with. So I'm glad I'm here. Let's start. Thanks, guys. So the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia has been an archive for over 30 years, coming up to 40 now. And in that time, it's done some physical presentation of exhibitions, but mostly it's been digital, especially from the 2000s and onwards. And so we've just recently gotten back into delivering physical exhibitions. And there's been a lot of questions back and forth about how we do this and what kind of audiences we're going to engage and so on. So we've done a lot of audience research online. You know, we've got a lot of different ranges of data. And as everyone has said, the numbers aren't super important, although I like the fact that they keep going up. That's good. And so we've got a pretty good idea of all of these numbers and all of the people that we're hitting online. But it was trying to figure out how we can measure these people coming into the center, see if we can cross them with our online visitors, because obviously as a national institute, we are reaching out to everyone on in Australia online, but not necessarily having all of those people then come to the center. So trying to find a way to see how closely those overlap was super important. Now we're really early into this process. I've come into the organization, into this role in order to help build up our digital engagement strategy for the organization. And so that includes not just physically in the building, but also online. And when I say physically in the building, I mean digital interactive experiences. So interactive ways in which the audience can engage with the content. Now, we have a lot of audiences requesting that we get physical objects in, but they're not exactly sure what it is we have. So we get sort of a push and pull online, and so we direct them to various collections of audio-visual material we have online. In instance of having a physical exhibition, it was important to us to pull out objects we have, which most people don't realize the NFSA actually has. So we're talking about costumes, diaries, books, things that are owned or were owned by directors and producers from various productions. We've got a lot of things from Baz Luhrmann and other Australian celebrities. So all of this combined led us to develop Australians in Hollywood. And Australians in Hollywood is a pretty ambitious exhibition because we had to develop it during COVID and only launched it earlier in January. But during the development of this, I was looking for a way to to insert our digital engagement capacity and our digital analytics capacity into the exhibition in a seamless and interactive way. And so we came up with the Spotlight Digital Companion. And the way this is developed is that you basically scan a QR code at the beginning of the exhibition. It takes you to a custom-made website. And as you go around the exhibition, you encounter various screens, and each screen has a GIF, and that GIF activates using your phone. You can select that GIF, and your phone actually takes that GIF into your phone and stores it in a set of pages that are kept for you as you experience the exhibition. And each of these are collected all the way through. So they're part of the experience. They have content with them. But the advantage of using a website is that it actually backends straight into Google Analytics. So we're capturing people's usages of this experience using the systems that we already have in place for our website, so we can actually monitor how people are using it and what kind of uptake we've got. And the two experiences that we provide for people as directors and designers, and these two experiences provide a range of different extra materials, additional content, link outs to our own website. So we've tried to create a feedback loop back into the website that enables us to double dip on our users so that they're using the physical experience, but also potentially jumping into the web experience as well. And at the end of this entire experience, the exhibition and the Spotlight Companion, there are post-visit activities they can do within it, which also are then analyzed and tagged by us using that same suite of tools. And so we're able to keep track of that. We can see that, for instance, about half of our visitors are uptaking this particular experience, which for those that have had experience with digital interactives built into exhibitions, that's not bad. Having half the people that you're trying to capture use this thing. And because it can be used on your own device and there's no touching of any objects or no touching of any experiences, it's very COVID safe, but it also means that you can, as a group, look at one person's screen. So there are a couple of things that we try to work around using analog data collection, and that is visitor observation from our staff and actual interviews, exit interviews that we do afterwards. So the combination of all these factors and the fact that the interactions are so short, so you scan a GIF with your phone, and that GIF is stored on your phone and collects it in your own special collage. It takes a couple of seconds, but it gives you a large range of content at the end, as well as you're moving through the space. So we're trying to balance it against the needs of an actual person walking through the space. And so far, the data says that we're doing pretty well. Now, as I said, this is all at the beginning of our journey into a physical space. So we're trying to use the tools that we currently have, plus a couple of others, and given the challenges of trying to develop this during COVID, it was interesting trying to do user testing with the public. But we found that there's been a crossover in our user base. So the people on our websites are coming to our physical space, but we're also getting new people to the physical space because we sit in Canberra, the national capital. So there's a lot of other institutions around us. And so people often do like the institution round where they go and visit as many of them as they can. But the consumption's been quite good. The number of uses per item is good, and people have been connecting with it on social media. So obviously we're still running this at the moment, but all of the data that we've collected so far has been quite positive, and the lessons that we're learning for how both our physical and digital audiences interact with our content and link out to other content has been really useful feedback, not just for the physical space, but also for the online space as well.
Thank you very much, Doug. I think you mentioned a really interesting point about lessons learned, and this is really part of the evaluation process, and I think that's really important as well. And I just wanted to check with Natalia that it's okay to ask one question to all participants.
I think if for everybody is okay
You
going
do
beyond
that.
timing, So yeah, I would love to hear more because all this
What has
is
been
so brilliant, and I'm learning so much from all these projects happening across museums.
okay? So the one question that I had was, how has the consultation process and the audience engagement analysis, how have these both processes changed ways in which GLAM institutions display and use their content, both online and in a physical way? So perhaps Adrian, if you could reflect on this a little bit.
So I think the main thing that we've recognized is that as a bicultural organization and as a organization with a particular goal in a colonial country, our maturity in understanding the fact that we actually serve our core audiences really well already, but we aren't necessarily doing so well with the audiences that we call priority. We still make lots of decisions that tend to exclude them. So by focusing on digital and actually focusing on, as we talked about, less of the generic audience research and really targeting the audiences that we want and finding out what it is that they need, and using digital as a channel that gives us opportunities to not only reach them, but to create content that doesn't need to have the limitations of what we put on floor, which we know about space and time and cost and all of those sorts of things. By tying those two things together a lot more, it's elevated the use of digital channels and it's elevated the reach and impact with a real focus on impact for those communities. It's still quite early for us, even though we are 24 years into being Te Papa and saying all of these things. But I feel like in the last 3 to 5 years, we've made some big strides in understanding that there are other ways to do things rather than just putting exhibitions onto the floor, but we just need to understand a bit more about the people that we're not reaching and what it is they actually want.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Amanda, would you like to add to what Adrian said in reference to your project?
I think I echo a lot of what Adrian's saying in terms of audiences and reaching different audiences. So the project that I presented was very much, which I think you touched on as well, geared at different audiences and trying to make, we have quite a big emphasis on accessibility. And so for us, this project was part of a bigger sort of thing we try to do at the museum, which is make things really accessible and easy for people to engage with, because when we do traditional research, we have people who visit the museum whose first language isn't English. So experiencing a traditional survey can be really tricky, or they may be intimidated by it. We have people who, as I mentioned, we engage with the deaf community quite a lot as well. And so to be able to do something to be able to connect with an audience in a way which everybody essentially can understand in terms of we try to use, a universal language essentially, was really important to us. And I think that that's something which I think I'm particularly interested in as well. And we all, I guess we're trying to grow different streams of the museum as well, and be more inclusive and break down the idea of the white box and all of those traditional stereotypes. So I think that how we use, I think it's, sort of building on what Adrian's saying, it's how we use data to understand the missing pieces, or also use research techniques to engage people who may be being missed.
Thank you very much. And Doug, any final remarks or thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously we're very new in the physical space after almost 2 decades, but we've done quite a lot of user testing online, trying to get get an understanding of our audiences. The thing being that as a national institute, we are here for everyone, as Adrian said, but we also know our own. Like we're at least somewhat aware of our own biases, our own deficits internally, and so we've been developing other avenues to try and get content engaging with various parts of our audience that we historically haven't. We've tried to adapt. So given the circumstances in which we developed this exhibition, we've kind of tried to adapt the methodologies we used online to the physical space. So it was very important to us that going forward, every single exhibition we develop always has an Indigenous voice, Indigenous voices through it, not just one voice, but multiple Indigenous voices all the way through it as part of the core story of Australia in the context of film. And so we were able to deliver that. We've had anecdotal positive feedback on how we've been able to do that, but this is all a continually learning experience for us, and it's going to be very, very valuable in the delivery of more exhibitions in the coming years.
Thank you very much, Doug, and thank you to all the panelists. And I would now like to hand over to Natalia for concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all. That was an amazing event. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you so much, David, for co-hosting that and, remind me about this wonderful place of the digital studio where everything started. Thank you, Corneliu, for facilitating this really insightful panel where I learned a lot. Two things that I particularly want to stress that I learned through this panel is that Kati mentioned that another layers of data are maybe more qualitative, more difficult to collect, are important to add. And I think the application that we are developing can really have this capability to add these layers of data. Also picking up from all the presentations, just from the discussion forum, I can see a lot of research is going on and a lot of data is being collected by museums. Also new data is being generated by all these applications that museums develop. This is the layer that could be added to more kind of automative aggregative data analysis. So this is fantastic. This is really amazing that we brought you all together to show us different dimensions of digital audience research. So, and another point that was made by Nils actually about making this application more actionable. So far, it does raises a lot of questions. Why we have more audiences here? Why here? It doesn't answer it. So how to make it more actionable? And I think with the help of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and with the help of aggregation of all the data which we can store and analyze and go in the past, we can actually make it, happen to answer all these questions eventually. So these are really brilliant insights that I received from all the panels. Thank you, Laura, for facilitating the last panel. Great event. Again, thank you, everybody. I would like to invite our audiences. Yes, and by the way, thank you for all the comments and all the discussions happening in our chat. That was very insightful with a lot of new links. That is amazing. Thank you for all the questions that you raised. So I would like to invite everybody to our final session that will happen in the end of May, and where we will, explore more on mapping of museum soft power, but from the perspective of traveling exhibitions. So thank you, and come back. Thank you very much.